promoting a healthy environment. It's the air we breathe. Clean, safe water. Responsible management of our natural resources. We protect and restore for a sustainable future. Environment matters.
Demolition work begins at Freedom Industries as crews begin the removal of all above-ground storage tanks at the site. Plus,
I think I have a unique perspective on the agency and on the state of the environment in West Virginia. You know, I'm a native of West Virginia. I started this position the first time around when I was 25 years old. 20 years to the day, I've come back.
we'll sit down with the DEP's Wendy Radcliffe on her return to the Office of Environmental Advocate and her vision for encouraging meaningful public input on matters of environmental protection. Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Environment Matters. I'm Greg Adolphson with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. More than 6 months after a leaking storage tank contaminated the drinking water supply for roughly 300,000 West Virginia residents, demolition work at the now bankrupt Freedom Industries is now underway. The restructuring team and the contractor, Independence Excavating, began work on July 15th. The project involves removing 10 steel tanks, including tank 396, which leaked roughly 10,000 gallons of the chemicals MCHM and PPH into the Elk River on January 9th. 4 tanks will remain on the site to store stormwater runoff, any rainwater or shallow groundwater that comes into contact with the potentially contaminated soil. The DEP's Sarah Sharp joins me now with the latest on the demolition and the investigation.
Greg, demolition for this phase of the project is expected to take 2 to 4 weeks, barring any major weather delays. DEP inspectors were on site for the beginning of the demolition and will remain on site for the duration of the project. There's also an asbestos removal contractor on hand to look for any asbestos-containing materials in areas inaccessible during last month's pre-demolition inspection. During demolition, areas inside the footprint of the tanks will be covered with liners so contaminated soil won't be exposed to rain during the demolition process. Crews will take steps to avoid cross-contamination from excess dirt and mud at the site, tracked by equipment and boots, and will use a vacuum truck to collect any liquids found at the surface after the tanks are removed. Work at the site will stop during significant rain events, and contractors will place the remains of the dismantled tanks inside a containment area until it can be loaded and hauled away. Once the tanks are removed, an extensive soil and groundwater analysis will begin to determine the scope of the contamination at the site and the steps needed to remediate it. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board recently released the preliminary findings of its ongoing investigation of the accident. It found 2 small holes, roughly 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, in the bottom of tank 396 that were likely caused by corrosion from water that leaked through holes in the roof of the tank and settled to the tank floor. Investigators also found a similar hole in the bottom of neighboring tank 397. Investigators have removed sections of the tank for analysis. The investigation has also turned up no records of any formal industry-approved inspections performed on any of the tanks by Freedom Industries prior to the January 9th leak. Earlier this year, Governor Tomlin signed legislation requiring annual inspections for above-ground storage tanks, along with leak detection systems and spill response plans. The DEP is currently working out the details of these new regulations. Speaking to Metro News Radio recently, DEP Cabinet Secretary Randy Huffman said, "Holes don't rust in steel overnight, or in a year, or 6 months. I believe that the testing protocols that we are going to be proposing here through the rule would absolutely have caught this, maybe have prevented it to begin with. These tanks have been here for decades. They're very old, and if there had been any kind of a certification testing process mechanism in place for looking at these tanks and ensuring their integrity, these tanks may have been torn down years ago." Greg, companies that have storage tanks that are covered under the new law have to register their tanks with the DEP. The law also requires all public water utilities that rely on surface water to have a source water protection plan in place by next July. For Environment Matters, I'm Sarah Sharp.
Thanks, Sarah. Tank owners are required to register their tanks with the DEP by October 1st. They must provide tank location and the specific liquids stored in there, the age of each tank, the material it's constructed of, what sort of secondary containment measures are in place, and whether it's regulated by any other state or federal program. Tank owners can get more information and register their tanks through our website, dep.wv.gov. Registration opened June 10th, and so far more than 2,200 tanks have been registered. That number is expected to increase dramatically before the October 1st deadline. Last year, the West Virginia legislature passed a bill requiring the DEP to produce new water quality standards for selenium as it relates to waterborne aquatic life. Now, halfway through a 2-year study, some interesting results are popping up. The DEP's Mike Huff has the details.
Located at number 34 on the periodic table of elements, selenium occurs naturally in various minerals. It's a trace element, essential to life in humans and some other species in small quantities, but toxic in greater concentrations. It gets into the water when rock strata containing selenium is disturbed and exposed to erosion by rainwater, rainfall, and runoff. In West Virginia, surface mining is one of the largest contributors to selenium inputs in the water. The U.S. EPA currently recommends a standard of 5 parts per billion for chronic exposure to aquatic life. The DEP study looks to determine if that standard should be changed by studying fish reproduction in streams that have historically higher concentrations of selenium.
The most vulnerable stage of aquatic life are larval freshwater fishes. So this study required an examination of multiple species of the eggs and subsequently reared fish larvae of our state stream fishes.
As part of the study, eggs are collected and hatched, and the fish larvae are screened to look for potential deformities that could be related to chronic selenium exposure. That's the stage of the study right now.
The mechanism that makes selenium problematic is the potential to substitute for sulfur in egg-bearing animals, particularly vertebrate animals, birds and fish, that use yolk to fuel the developmental stages of their offspring. Those yolk are typically rich in sulfur, and the purported mechanism, if selenium is present instead of sulfur, you get deformities that are created as the progeny begin to develop. It's particularly during protein making processes. You can have selenium substitute for sulfur. The bonding is different between the two, so you get gross deformities that can develop with selenium. Typically, you screen larval fishes for facial deformities, eyes, jaw deformities, fin deformities, and spinal deformities. In West Virginia waters, we believe, or it initially looks, is that even though we have areas where we have exceeded the current national recommended water quality criterion, we really don't see the population level effects with fish yet. For example, we have many sites that have exceeded those in-stream numbers for years, but yet we haven't seen the resultant consequences that should be taking place within the fish community if there are those types of biological effects actually taking place. So that's part of this study as well, is to examine, why in this stream that typically runs 15 parts per billion haven't we seen the loss of taxa in regard to the fish assemblage that we would expect if, in fact, the criterion should be a 5. Or maybe in that particular case where you have flowing water, the real criterion should be 15, or maybe even higher, depending on what we see in the fish community. But obviously, if the exposure's there and we don't have the effects, that tells us that we are at least protected at that level.
And that's the importance of setting a state-specific standard. Once selenium gets into dissolved form, it can be very difficult to remove from the water column. Getting an accurate idea of exactly where selenium in the water starts creating problems for aquatic life allows resources for mitigation to be used where they're actually needed.
The study is also very large in scope for selenium evaluations that include early life stage or larval evaluations. We have around 30 sites in 6 different watersheds that are covered. And additionally, we're looking at species that have not really been examined before, not when the larval evaluation was part of that process.
The study also uses underwater video to document fish behavior, giving a rare glimpse into the reproductive cycle.
One of the most surprising aspects of the video to me was the degree to which the fish totally would disregard the camera's presence. They very quickly, after setting up the camera, would come back and continue their spawning activities because the reproductive drives were so strong. We would be within, just a few feet of them with the camera there, and they were right back, going back to their spawning activity.
In Charleston, I'm Mike Huff for Environment Matters.
The DEP is partnering with Marshall University researchers for this study. Coming up,
people are seeing that, hey, what we're doing is really unique and worthwhile, and I think it's increasing participation overall.
a sustainability program in one West Virginia community is getting some national recognition. Plus,
I really see this office as being here to help those that are interested in trying to get the most out of the DEP that they can and working to try to effectively change things through the process.
a conversation with DEP environmental advocate Wendy Radcliffe. Those stories and more when Environment Matters continues.